Welcome to this podcast on the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, often referred to as the Paris Accords or the Paris Climate Accords, is an international treaty on climate change adopted in 2015. It covers climate change mitigation, adaptation, and finance. The agreement was negotiated by 196 parties at the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference near Paris, France. The Paris Agreement was opened for signature on 22nd April 2016, on Earth Day, at a ceremony in New York. After the European Union ratified the agreement, sufficient countries had ratified the agreement responsible for enough of the world's greenhouse gases for the agreement to enter into force on 4th November 2016. As of July 2021, 191 members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, are parties to the agreement. Of the 6 UNFCCC member states which have not ratified the agreement, the only major emitters are Iran, Turkey, and Iraq, though the President has approved that country's accession. The United States withdrew from the agreement in 2020 but rejoined in 2021. The Paris Agreement's long-term temperature goal is to keep the rise in mean global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and preferably limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, recognizing that this would substantially reduce the impacts of climate change. Emissions should be reduced as soon as possible and reach net zero in the second half of the 21st century. It aims to increase the ability of parties to adapt to climate change impacts and mobilize sufficient finance. Under the agreement, each country must determine, plan, and regularly report on its contributions. No mechanism forces a country to set specific emission targets, but each target should go beyond previous targets. In contrast to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, the distinction between developed and developing countries is blurred, so that the latter also have to submit plans for emission reductions. The Paris Agreement was lauded by world leaders, but criticized as insufficiently binding by some environmentalists and analysts. There is debate about the effectiveness of the agreement. While current pledges under the Paris Agreement are sufficient for reaching the set temperature goals, there is a mechanism of increased ambition. The Paris Agreement has been successfully used in climate litigation, forcing countries and an oil company to strengthen climate action. Let's look at the implementation and effectiveness of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is implemented via national policy. It would involve improvements to energy efficiency to decrease the energy intensity of the global economy. Implementation also requires fossil fuel burning to be cut back and the share of sustainable energy to grow rapidly. Emissions are being reduced rapidly in the electricity sector, but not in the building, transport, and heating sector. Some industries are difficult to decarbonize, and for those carbon dioxide removal may be necessary to achieve net zero emissions. There are barriers to implementing the agreement. Some countries struggle to attract the finance often considered necessary for investments in decarbonization. Climate finance is fragmented, further complicating investments. Another issue is the lack of capabilities in government and other institutions to implement policy. Clean technology and knowledge is often not transferred to countries or places that need it. In December 2020, the former chair of the COP21, Laurent Fabius, argued that the implementation of the Paris Agreement could be bolstered by the adoption of a global pact for the environment. The latter would define the environmental rights and duties of states, individuals, and businesses. Effectiveness of mitigation. The effectiveness of the Paris Climate Agreement to reach its climate goals is under debate, with most experts saying it is insufficient for its more ambitious goal of keeping global temperature rise under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Many of the exact provisions of the Paris Agreement have yet to be straightened out, so that it may be too early to judge effectiveness. According to the 2020 United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, With the current timeline commitments of the Paris Agreement, global mean temperatures will likely rise by more than 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. Newer net zero commitments were not included in the NDCs and may bring down temperature a further 0.5 degrees Celsius. With initial pledges by countries inadequate, faster and more expensive future mitigation would be needed to still reach the targets. Furthermore, there is a gap between pledges by countries in their NDCs and implementation of these pledges. 1/3 of the emission gap between the lowest cost and actual reductions in emissions would be closed by implementing existing pledges. A pair of studies in Nature found that as of 2017, none of the major industrialized nations were implementing the policies they had pledged, and none met their pledged emission reduction targets. And even if they had, the sum of all member pledges as of 2016 would not keep the global temperature rise well below 2 degrees Celsius. In 2021, a study using a probabilistic model concluded that the rates of emissions reductions would have to increase by 80% beyond NDCs to likely meet the 2 degrees Celsius upper target of the Paris Agreement, and that the probabilities of major emitters meeting their NDCs without such an increase is very low. It is estimated that with the current trends, the probability of staying below 2 degrees Celsius of warming is 5%, and 26% if NDCs were met and continued post-2030 by all signatories. The effectiveness of capacity building and adaptation. As of 2020, there is little scientific literature on the topics of the effectiveness of the Paris Climate Agreement on capacity building and adaptation, even though they feature prominently in the Paris Agreement. The literature available is mostly mixed in its conclusions about loss and damage and adaptation. Thank you very much for listening to this podcast on an extremely important topic on the Paris Climate Agreement.